Rifles, machine guns, artillery, and tanks were some of the deadliest weapons used during World War I. But these are not the weapons I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to focus on another weapon, a type of weapon that constitutes of the spreading of ideas, information, or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. If you haven't guessed it yet, it's propaganda. Propaganda materials were everywhere during World War I. By the end of 1916, Britain's war pictorial was printed in 500,000 copies per issue in 11 different languages. In the year after, an estimate of 40 million propaganda posters were manufactured solely for overseas use. The British had a really strong propaganda game going on. In this podcast, I'll look at these 4 British posters to demonstrate how the propaganda tactics of Britain dictated and guided the use of propaganda globally and led to the involvement of entire nations into supporting World War I. Before we take a closer look at these posters though, let's talk about why this medium in particular proved to be so effective at the time. In 1914, when the First World War began, the TV had not been invented yet, and the radio was not widely available. This made printed material the most accessible, easily distributable, and economic way of disseminating information. The pioneering of airplanes which dispersed propaganda materials over wide territories also aided the ease of spreading and the audiences which the propaganda posters could reach. The posters were also very practical. Printing companies posted them on walls, windows, on the side of cable cars, resized them to fit inside newspapers, or easily altered them to convey messages in different languages. But posters were also practical because illustrators could use advertising strategies to evoke emotional responses by visualizing different content. Another reason the poster was a convenient medium were the loosened advertising regulations on posters which governments enacted around Europe in the second half of the 19th century. In 1869 in France, Jules Charest introduced a system of 3-color lithographic printing that assured accurate color registration, and this made the posters very popular. The popularity eventually led to the passage of the French press law in 1881, which granted posters protection from censorship and vandalism, which quickly spread in other countries. These first 2 British propaganda posters that we're looking at were targeted locally, at the British nation, but were heavy influencers on a global level too. They were meant to elicit a feeling of pride and patriotism as emotional drivers which made people socially conscious and more likely to enlist in the army. They were psychological tools which the government utilized to gain nationwide support in fighting the war, and they succeeded. Britain entered the war with one of the smallest armies compared to other big forces like Germany and France. Although it is difficult to infer causality between the propaganda posters and the increased number of enlisting men, the timing is difficult to ignore. As the government disseminated the posters around the nation, men began flooding recruitment centers and immensely reinforced the British Army. The first poster portrays Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of State of War at the time. He stands in a very assertive, demanding, and intimidating pose with his finger pointed at the viewers requesting that they join the British Army. The poster was targeted at the British men by playing to their senses in several ways. At the top, in a bright red text, most prominent of all, it read Britons, and in conjunction with the Join Your Country's Army text evokes a sense of nationalism and patriotism. With an added layer, it also plays the religious card and evokes a sense of responsibility towards the king with the line at the very bottom which reads, God save the king. The publication of this poster in September of 1914 coincided with the highest enlisting in the British Army up to then, but its impact was not confined to Britain. Seen as a masterful piece of propaganda, the poster inspired similar poster compositions around the world. The demanding posture was recreated on posters in the US, Canada, the Soviet Union, and Germany, aimed to similarly affect their respective nations in getting involved in the war in different capacities. It has also since become a popular concept used again in the Second World War and in various campaigns afterwards. This second poster shows 2 women and a child in an open window as a group of soldiers are walking away. At the top it reads, "Women of Britain say go." This poster is more emotionally charged and double-sided than the previous. It plays on the family values and the duty of the men in each family to fight for the nation. But it also gets the women involved by invoking their duty to support the men and take care of the children. In a way, it portrays the deeply patriarchal society in which at the time women were not allowed to be on the front. What it fails to convey, however, is that despite the prohibition of being on the front, women played key roles during the war by filling vacancies in local factories or serving as cooks and nurses at army camps. This and similar other posters also reinforced the medieval conception of the war. Posters illustrating male heroism and notions of medieval soldier representations disregarded the reality of the situations and the millions of soldiers which were involved. But the misrepresentations were intentional. It was a means of provoking activity in armies who had globally begun taking a defensive stance, rarely taking initiative to attack the enemy. These next two posters were aimed at outside nations, but with two very different messages. The first one was targeted at Britain's colonies, Australia, Canada, India, and New Zealand. It shows Britain as the male lion perched on top of a rock, Lion King style, with the colonies portrayed as young lions inferiorly situated at the back. The posters called for support for Britain by asking men in these four countries to enlist in the army. This poster is just one example of how Britain continued to uphold its imperial views and air of superiority over its colonial subjects. Not portrayed is how Britain, despite aiming to promote unition of people for justice and fighting the enemy, also continued to discriminate on racial and ethnic grounds. British captains, for example, treated Indian soldiers as inferior. They acknowledged that Indians were courageous soldiers but labeled them unfit to lead and in need of British guidance. This also fed into the centuries-old narrative of racial inferiority and added more to the pile of historical injustices, together with Germany's use of attacking the British for using savages from Asia and Africa to fight the civilized people of Europe. This final poster was aimed at villainizing Germany. It shows Belgium on one side, which had been attacked by Germany with its homes destroyed and women and children dead or enslaved, and England on the other, with secure homes and safe women and children. At the top it reads, "The Hun and the Home." Hun during World War I became a term that was used to refer to Germans. It was in reference to the Huns, a nomadic people from east of the Volga River who migrated to Europe in the 4th century. Throughout history, they have been portrayed as barbaric and uncivilized, similar to how Britain painted Germany in the war. The British efforts of demonstrating the lawlessness and uncivilized nature of the Germans did not stop there. The Wellington House, a British government organization founded for propaganda purposes, reported the atrocities of the Hun in the war pictorial which they printed around the world. This continued to paint the German as barbaric, reporting how they cut off hands of children, boiled corpses to make soap, and crucified prisoners of war. Many of these allegations were false, but they did the job. The propaganda was so strong that it contributed to countries like China turning against Germany. So, to quickly recap, these posters demonstrate the all-encompassing nature of the British propaganda tactics and how their masterfully crafted content and effective dissemination led to both local and global impact. The content played on different emotions and feelings, from patriotism to nationalism, pride, duty, and honor. This got the entire nation involved and in support of the war, and with a little support from the international branches of the British propaganda institutions, the concept spread globally and led to similar effects in nations around the world. The posters were also powerful portrayals of what Britain wanted to be seen as, a nation fighting for global justice. Finally, with some help of exaggerated and false reports of the deeds of the opponent, these posters succeeded in painting Germany as the big bad wolf that countries globally needed to unite against. The dissemination tactics of Britain were no less exquisite. Even though the official government institutions were in the propaganda driver's seat, they let local organizations, authorities, and newspapers act as the information distributors. The nation thus did not question the content they were being fed and quickly got behind supporting the war. British authorities employed similar covert tactics in influencing propaganda efforts internationally by infiltrating institutions and guiding the production of materials in countries like the US, Canada, India, and South Africa. After the end of the war and years later, the legacy of the British propaganda posters persisted. Concepts first invented then were widely reused in World War II and even praised by Hitler himself, as the most successful official effort of influencing the opinions of the masses. But something else that the British World War I tactics left us with is the notion of how powerful of a weapon propaganda can be. We humans are psychological beings as much as we are physical. Control of our thoughts, ideas, and opinions may not directly injure anybody. But as the British demonstrated, it can certainly rally the masses in supporting war and shaping the outcomes of events globally.